So, hello everyone. Hello, sir. Great to have you all here. We're about to begin our thought provoking book talk session, exploring the interventions of academia, intellectualism, and social responsibility. This event is proudly hosted by the Magazine Committee of Farouk Training College. So, we are glad to have our respected principal here with us. I now invite our principal, Professor Dr. T. Mohammed Salim sir, to share some words with us. Sir, please.
Good evening. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you're audible.
Yes. Most beloved and respected Mr. Nick riemer, other distinguished participants in this discussion, my dear colleagues, my dear professor scholars and students. It's my great pleasure to be with you, join with a truly different endeavor organized by the Magazine Committee of Farouk Training College. First of all, I would like to congratulate the team, the magazine team of Farouk Training College, for organizing such a different eve, especially a discussion on a most relevant topic and which is also associated with a renowned book. Farouk Training College is a well-known, reputed institution established in 1961, and the institution is upgraded as postgraduate college in the year 1995. Later, it is upgraded as a research center in 2012. And today, Farouk Training College is the destination of teacher education in the Farouk College campus. And also, this institution is the largest research center in the state of Kerala. So, our task is molding teachers with a visionary slogan that is enter to learn, exit to serve. We welcome our students for the world of knowledge, especially in the area of pedagogy, and enable them, preparing them to serve the society. In that sense, each and every activity of this college is entirely different from that of the any type of higher education institution, molding the teachers. In that sense, in this small state, Kerala, always Kerala is showing difference when compared to other states, especially in education, health, and similar areas. In teacher education also, we have a reputed history, a tradition, a value concept, everything. And special to our students, those who are admitting this college is highly meritorious students from inside and outside the native district of Calicut. And also, the students are very, very intelligent in their academics. That is why we are concentrating on activities beyond the classroom or outside the classroom. Here, this new venture conducted by the magazine committee organizing a discussion on renowned books with a renowned scholar, the author, respected Nick riemer. So it's my privilege and proud to welcome you, Mr. Nick, to this campus. Farooq College is known as Rawzatul Ulum. That is Arabic word. That is, it means the garden of knowledge. That means we are providing all type of education here, rightly from lower primary school and up to civil service coaching. A wide array of institutions are here, both in the government aided mode and self-finance mode. It varies from schools, colleges, management institute, and technical institute, everything. So it is our privilege and proud to welcome you, sir, to this campus. And I hope many distinguished personalities are joining with us in this discussion. I don't want to prolong my words because the time is very precious for us. So, once again, I would like to appreciate the magazine team for such a wonderful program, and I wish all the best, all the very best for the program. And I hope all the participants may contribute to this discussion. And the outcome of this discussion definitely will change the tone of our upcoming magazine. And I hope which will be somewhat different from other college magazines. And I hope uh, I wish all the very best for the program. Once again, welcome Nick, Riemer, and other distinguished guests to this function. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It's an absolute honor to introduce Nick Raymer, a distinguished scholar and senior lecturer in the discipline of English and Writing at the University of Sydney. With a BA and PhD from the same institution, he is recognized for his critical engagement with linguistics, semantics, and semiotics. Today, we are discussing his work, Boycott Theory and Struggle for Palestine, Universities, Intellectualism and Liberation, which explores the ethical responsibilities of academic institutions in the context of socio-political struggles. He has authored several other books and published extensively in leading academic journals. He is a passionate advocate for Palestinian rights, supporting movements against the oppression of Palestinians and condemning Israeli actions. His scholarship and activism demonstrate his commitment to social justice, making him a significant voice in both academia and human rights advocacy. With great respect for his scholarly achievements and his dedication to social justice, I'm honored to invite Dr. Nick Raymer to this talk. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to the magazine committee and to Farooq Training College for asking me to speak. I'm very happy to be here. And I'm also interested in learning I hope a bit about the situation with Palestine advocacy in India. Before I go any further, I wonder, is it possible for me to share my screen? Because I do have some slides that I'd like to show if that's possible, but it doesn't matter if it's not, but I'm not sure whether, at the moment I can't, I don't seem to be able to share my screen.
Yes, sir, you can share your screen. It's okay.
It's just that the platform says I'm not allowed to, so maybe that's something in the settings that could be changed. If not, it doesn't matter. Oh, yeah, wonderful. Okay, thank you. So I'll just bring up this slide and okay, it's for some reason it's not letting me do that, so I'll just not worry about sharing the screen. Okay, well, look, let me begin by just recognising that I'm speaking to you tonight from Sydney in Australia, which is stolen Aboriginal land. I'm here on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It always was Aboriginal land and it always will be. And it was stolen from Aboriginal people in 1788, and Aboriginal people in Sydney continue to be the objects of very serious and often violent dispossession and discrimination at the hands of the Australian settler state. And it's impossible, I think, to talk about the dispossession of Palestinians in Australia without also talking about or being conscious of the dispossession that Indigenous people here in Australia are continuing to suffer at the same time. So I express my respect to Gadigal elders, past and present. So you've asked me to speak about my book on the academic boycott of Israel, which I'm very happy to do. This book was written and published before the current genocide, which means that in many ways it's been completely overtaken by events since October the 7th, the Hamas attack in Israel and the subsequent horrifying genocidal response that Israel is continuing to make. That response, Israel's actions since the 7th of October 2023, and the reaction to them that universities in the global north have shown, tragically confirm, I think, the analysis that I put forward in the book and that I'm going to illustrate tonight and go into tonight. So what I'd like to do is to spend most of the talk describing some of the book's main arguments. But before I do that, I might just give some brief indications about the campaign for the academic boycott of Israel, in case it's not clear or is unfamiliar to people here. And perhaps I'll pause at various points in the hope that we can have some discussion and questions perhaps along the way, because otherwise it will be a very long evening if I just speak continuously and without interruption. So what's the academic boycott of Israel? Well, boycotting has been a permanent component of Palestinians' resistance to Zionism for over a century. But more recently, as many people probably know, in 2005, so 20 years ago, a call for a systematic campaign of boycott, divestment and sanctions against Israel was issued by 173 Palestinian unions, professional associations, refugee and human rights organisations, and a whole range of other cultural and community groups, things like charities and religious groups as well. And given the persistent and merciless occupation and apartheid to which they were subject, Palestinians called on international civil society to impose broad boycotts and implement divestment initiatives against Israel, similar to the ones that were applied against South Africa in the apartheid era. And Palestinians also called on supporters to pressure governments to impose embargoes and sanctions against Israel. And that call came in a situation where official diplomatic and legal mechanisms had spectacularly failed to get Palestinians any semblance of the justice and restitution of their land that they were looking for. Ever since the Oslo Accords had been signed, it had become entirely clear that there was no prospect for genuine Palestinian liberation in the framework of the so-called rules-based international order. And as a result, the BDS campaign proposed to change tack by returning some leverage over global justice to ordinary people, and by starting a campaign that would actually be led by Palestinians themselves at the grassroots level. And I think it's true to say that no other liberation campaign has ever received as comprehensive a mandate from Palestinian society as the BDS campaign has received. And what that means is that those people in the global north, or those people generally internationally, who refuse to engage in the BDS campaign are effectively turning their backs on the entire Palestinian people. They're refusing a call which has been made by the entire Palestinian people. And it's an interesting fact that within this whole wider campaign for boycott, divestment and sanctions, the academic part of that campaign was actually the first which took shape. So in 2004, the newly constituted organisation called the Palestinian Campaign for the Academic and Cultural Boycott of Israel, that's PACBI. So PACBI asked international academics to comprehensively and consistently boycott all Israeli academic and cultural institutions as a contribution to the struggle to end Israel's occupation, colonization, and system of apartheid. And at the same time as it asked academics to do that, it also asked us to directly support Palestinian academic and cultural institutions. And since the start of the genocide, so since October 23, that call for the academic boycott has been consistently repeated by academics and universities and unions in Gaza and in the West Bank. So in the second month of the genocide, in November of 2023, there was a very explicit call from all Palestinian universities, coordinated by Birzeit University in the West Bank, for academics internationally to isolate Israeli universities as a means of pressure on the Israeli state, in the hope that doing so would bring an end to the genocidal attacks on Gaza. And in the context of the academic boycott, it's very important, I think, to appreciate that the boycott is not a blanket boycott of all Israeli academics, all and any Israeli academics. Quite the contrary. The official boycott guidelines make it clear that the mere fact that you belong to an Israeli university, the mere fact that you work at a university in Israel, doesn't qualify any academic for boycott. The boycott only applies to official institutional leaders, that is, people like university presidents, deans of universities in Israel acting in their official capacity. And it targets those people because they have freely chosen to make themselves accountable for their university's commitment to fostering apartheid and genocide against Palestinians. The boycott also applies to anyone outside Israel who is using official academic structures that are sponsored by Israeli universities. So examples of that would be conferences and exchange programs that happen under the aegis of Israeli institutions. And so this is all the institutional character of the academic boycott campaign. It's not a boycott of individuals, it's a boycott of Israeli institutions. And that's a very important distinguishing feature of it. And it's a feature that I think makes the campaign a lot weaker, and also I would say a lot more just as a form of boycott compared to the academic boycott of South Africa. Because the academic boycott of South Africa did in fact target individual South African academics, which is something that the Palestinian boycott campaign specifically refuses to do. So that's some background about the the main topic of the book for people who may not be familiar with it. I'm not sure whether now would be a good time to pause in case there are any questions or there's anything that people would like to say. If not, I can just go on.
I think you can continue.
Okay, all right, I'll continue. Okay, thank you. Well, look, so let me say a few words about the book specifically now. So the book is a study and at the same time a defence of the academic boycott campaign, and it springs from my direct experience with the academic boycott and my observation of the way that the campaign for the boycott has played out in academic contexts throughout the global north, throughout the West. And among other things, the book's intended as a resource for the Palestine solidarity movement. And I want to showcase in the book just how solid the arguments for the academic boycott of Israel are. Because on the face of it, it would seem that it was in the activities of universities, teaching and research, it would seem that they are things where a boycott is least justifiable. We think of teaching and research, rightly, I think, as being social goods. So it's a natural thought that there must be something wrong about calling for them to be interrupted or boycotted. But as I show in the book, and as many people argue, of course, boycotting academic work is in fact exactly what it's necessary to do in the case of Israel. And if that's the case, if it's the case that the sort of most unlikely form of boycott is in fact justified, then that implies that all the other forms of boycott are justifiable too. So if it's okay to boycott universities, surely it's okay to boycott cultural events, for example. Surely it's okay to boycott commerce. So my thought is that by defending the apparently least defensible form of the boycott against Israel, we in a sense get a justification for all of the other forms of boycott for free, in a sense. And then perhaps I can also just mention another motivation that I had for writing the book, which is a secondary one, but still I think an interesting one, which is the very high intrinsic interest of the underlying background issue that the academic boycott raises, which is simply this question of the relationship between intellectual and political progress. You know, how does the intellectual and theoretical progress that universities purport to sponsor, how does that relate to actual political progress in the emancipation of human societies? And in a way, that's a version of a very old question, the question of the relation between theory and practice. And it's a politically and intellectually extremely rich question, I think. So the theme of the political effects of academic work, I suppose I could put it like that, the political effects of academic work, that's sort of central to the book, along with the question of the varied ways in which intellectual activity in general, particularly institutionalized intellectual activity, like in universities, the ways that can relate to action. Okay, so perhaps now I can go through some of the arguments of the book in a bit more detail. And the book starts with the most particular and specific issues that relate to the academic boycott, and it goes on then to the most general ones. And the starting point is a detailed description of the daily reality of university life in occupied Palestine. And because this book was written before the genocide started, that picture has very significantly changed. It's now well known that Israel has destroyed all of Gaza's universities. And that had not happened, of course, at the time that the book was published in the start of 2023. That's well known, but what's less well known are the simply impossible conditions under which Palestinian universities were already operating, even before the genocide. And the fact that academics elsewhere in the world knew very little about what their colleagues in Palestine were facing, that ignorance was a real obstacle, I think, to academics seeing the boycott of Israel as something important, as something that was necessary. And so the opening chapter of the book really outlines in some detail exactly what it was like to study and to be an academic at West Bank universities before the genocide. And it gives a detailed account of the impossible conditions that Israeli academics and students were operating under. You know, the impossibility of getting to the university itself physically because of the checkpoints that are everywhere on the West Bank. The raids that the Israeli army regularly conducts on Palestinian university campuses, the arrests of students, the extreme difficulty for universities to provision themselves with things like as simple as books, the severe obstacles for universities to internationalize by receiving visits, or still more, having faculty come from overseas. All of these things and more made studying in Palestine, made the project of being a university in Palestine almost impossible. And the importance of that for us now, I think, is that it shows that even when the Palestine Solidarity Movement succeeds in ending this genocide, and even when things return to some semblance of what they were beforehand, if only in the West Bank, Palestinians will still be in an untenable and impossible situation as far as higher education goes. So once we end the genocide, we then have to end the apartheid and the ethnic cleansing and the severe educational injustice that Palestinians have been subject to for decades. And as well as describing the terrible situation that Palestinian universities are in, the book's first chapter also goes in some detail into Israeli universities' responsibility for the attacks on Palestinians and for the systemic exploitation and ethnic cleansing and apartheid that the Israeli state exerts against Palestinians. And since I wrote my book, a much richer resource has emerged on that very question in the form of the excellent book by the Israeli scholar Maya Wind, which you may already know. It's called Towers of Ivory and Steel, published by Verso, I think also in 2023, which is an exhaustive exemplification of the facts that I go into at much less length in the first chapter of my book, and which I think are now largely a matter of public record. It's just a matter of public record now that Israeli universities are centrally involved in the maintenance of exploitative and murderous practices against Palestinians. They're linchpins of Israel's program of systemic apartheid, ethnic cleansing, and now genocide. Just to give one perhaps less well-known example of this, I think the involvement of Palestinian universities in military research is very well known now. What's less well known, perhaps, is that Israeli universities are responsible for training officers in the Israeli armed forces. And it's also not sufficiently well known that many Israeli universities maintain think tanks like the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, which are centrally involved in promoting Zionism and promoting anti-Palestinianism in Israeli society and internationally. And since October 7, the involvement of Israeli universities and of these think tanks in the genocide has been flagrant, I think. And so it's this kind of institutional involvement that Israeli universities have in the project of Palestinian dispossession and Palestinian destruction. It's this involvement that really justifies the boycott against Israeli universities and their leaders. So that's, I suppose, the sort of essential empirical justification for the boycott of Israeli universities. The fact that, as a simple matter of fact, they are institutionally committed to anti-Palestinianism, no matter how much they might try to hide that. But when you say that, you immediately get a particular reply. You get the reply that, of course, Israeli universities support the Israeli state's strategic, international and domestic objectives. Of course they do that. All universities everywhere are caught up with the unsavoury activities of the countries that they're in. And what happens then is that we, Palestine supporters, are criticised for supposedly making an exception of Israel. People say to us, look, why are you criticising Israel for supporting its home state? All universities support their home state. And then those kinds of accusations are very likely to immediately turn to the accusation that the reason we are targeting Israel is just that we're anti-Semitic. And our Zionist accusers say that if the boycott campaign was applied consistently, it would mean that we would have to boycott all universities, including the universities at which we happen to work. So I would have to boycott the University of Sydney, for example. Actually, I'd be quite happy to do that in all sorts of ways. But our accusers, Zionists, see this as a very decisive point that demonstrates what they see as the incoherence of the entire boycott campaign. And this objection is just made all the time. We can call it the selectivity objection. It's the objection that the boycott campaign against Israel is essentially incoherent at best and anti-Semitic at worst because it singles Israel out for kinds of criticism and kinds of responses that aren't made to any other comparable states. And this is the subject that I take up in the second chapter of the book. And there's lots that we can say about it. And perhaps the most basic and, I think, powerful response that defenders of Palestine can make to this objection against us is to just point out that it's, as a matter of fact, factually completely incorrect. It is simply not the case that boycott campaigners, that Palestine advocates do single out Israel. Palestine advocates like myself, including myself, typically participate in multiple campaigns on multiple social justice issues. And some of these campaigns also involve calls to boycott other entities other than Israel itself. So the factual basis of this claim that we are singling Israel out is simply missing. And I could illustrate that. At length if it was necessary, but I don't think it's necessary. Perhaps I can just point out that, for example, in Australia, supporters of Palestinian liberation are regularly heavily involved in struggles for and with Indigenous people. So we don't, and that might well include calls to boycott various events or various organisations which are complicit in injustice towards or exploitation against Indigenous people. But actually, even if we were just boycotting Israel, even if that was true, the objection against it would not be reasonable. Why not? Well, because boycotting isn't something that you always have to do, regardless of the campaign that it's part of. Boycotting is a tactic which you adopt when there are grounds to believe that it will be effective. So because boycott is just a tactic, there's no reason that it has to be universally applied. And there's no inconsistency involved if it so happens that only a single campaign happens to use it. So there might, for example, be any number of reasons for which boycotts are presently the right approach for the campaign for Palestinian rights, but not for others. And the final thing, I'm spending a bit of time on this objection just because it is so powerful. Even now, people try to stop us standing up for Palestine on the grounds that it's selective and prejudicial against Israel to do it. I find it deeply astonishing that people still find it possible to make this objection, but they still do. So I think it's important to counter it as forcefully as possible. And I think that the single most important reason to reject this objection and to insist on the need to join in the boycott of Israel is the following. It's that Palestinian academics have continually asked their international colleagues to boycott Israel. They have continually asked us to do that for the last 20 years. They are continuing to ask us to do that. And to say in reply to them that we won't do that because that would be unfairly singling out Israel, unfairly singling out a genocidal state which is structurally committed to apartheid and ethnic cleansing. To say that the boycott against a state like that is unfair is just reflects a perception of politics that I find highly perverse and untenable. We're being asked to adopt an essentially abstract attitude, as though we're surveying the scenery of global oppression from a great distance. And from that sort of privileged surveying point, we notice that that some countries like Israel are boycott targets and others aren't. And from that perspective, that seems inconsistent and therefore undesirable. And for that reason, we have to stop the boycott of Israel now. I mean, it's absolutely absurd. It's an absolutely absurd objection because it misses the fact that Palestinians are directly asking the world for solidarity and that there is an energetic and indeed growing campaign that has emerged to boycott Israel. And once we recognise that reality, the question isn't whether it's fair to Israel to boycott it and not to boycott other countries, but whether or not we're going to be part of an actually existing campaign to reverse the historic injustice against Palestinians. So look, there's a lot more that I could say about that objection, but I won't. Maybe I will just again pause to see if there's anything anyone wants to say or whether there are questions.
Sir, I want to ask you that how does BDS hold significance in this context of settler colonialism? What is the impact? I want to know that.
Well, yes, that's a good question because obviously the Palestine Solidarity Movement has increasingly, over the last few decades, stressed the character of Israel as a settler colonial nation. So a nation like Australia, for example, or like Canada or New Zealand. And the immediate effect of that claim, I think, has been to draw attention to the solidarity and the connections between the struggle for Palestinian liberation and the struggle against racism and neo-colonial control of indigenous populations elsewhere in the world, in places exactly like Australia, the United States, Canada, and so on. So the claim is that Palestinians are indigenous to Palestine, and that the kinds of exploitation and oppression that they have been experiencing since at least 1948, those kinds of oppression are of a piece, are similar to the kinds of oppression that Australian Aboriginal people experience in Australia, Maori experience in New Zealand, Indigenous Americans experience in North America. And that has immediate implications for the nature of the resistance to that kind of oppression, because it internationalizes that oppression. And it also highlights the sort of structural similarities or the structural affinities that exist between settler colonial states, because it's a striking fact that in a place like Australia, for example, which is the context I'm most familiar with, the Australian state, quite independently of whichever political party happens to be in power, but the Australian state has a bipartisan, extremely strong commitment to Israel. And there are a number of reasons for that, but I think one of the reasons in the background is a sort of settler colonial solidarity and an appreciation that a place like Israel and a place like Australia, on some level, are similar kinds of places and have similar kinds of problems. And certainly in a place like here, Australia, the connections between the Palestine Solidarity Movement and the movement for justice for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people is very strong.
Okay, sir. So, according to the BDS critics, BDS movement limits academic freedom by preventing scholars from exchanging ideas. This limit their academic exchange with the global universities. We know that. However, the proponents of this BDS or this academic boycott feel that protesting against the discrimination Palestinians face is essential. Does this boycott genuinely highlight how some educational exchanges can conceal the reality of oppression or propagate propagate misconceptions, or can it undermine intellectual freedom? What is the exact condition? Are they actually undermining the intellectual freedom?
Right. Yes, that's the central question. That's the central question, I think. Maybe the first thing to say is that the boycott is intended to promote the intellectual freedom of Palestinians. So that's the first point. The boycott intends to bring to an end the system of apartheid and ethnic cleansing that exists in historic Palestine, and in order to restore justice, educational justice, social justice, all sorts of forms of justice to Palestinian people. So boycott proponents regularly stress the fact that the boycott is a tool to increase and to promote academic freedom, Palestinians' academic freedom, which at the moment is compromised to an extent that it's very difficult for people outside that context to even comprehend. I mean, higher education is more or less impossible in Palestine. I mean, since October the 7th, even in the West Bank, in the West Bank has obviously been subject to intense escalation in Israeli attacks since October the 7th. And in many West Bank universities, or perhaps all, I'm not exactly sure, but in many, teaching has had to partly at least go online. So the possibility of physically coming to campus in West Bank universities that possibility has been removed for many students, as it regularly has been in the past. So there is no academic freedom for Palestinians, either students or lecturers. And the kinds of boycott that are involved in the academic boycott of Israel are extremely mild. They're extremely mild. They just affect things like conference participation, student exchanges, interactions with office holders. They allow the business of Israeli universities to continue almost without interruption. So the idea that there is a more serious detriment to Israeli universities than there is to Palestinian ones is absurd. And boycott proponents need always to stress the fact that boycotting is about promoting Palestinian academic freedom.
Yes, sir. So we can see that in Israel, the higher education institutes are actually connected with military associations. They're connectively doing that apartheid on Palestinians. So how it affecting on their day-to-day life of the Palestinian students, and what is their condition in Israeli universities now? The condition of Palestinian students.
Well, I mean, it's terrible. Obviously, it's terrible. I mean, it's difficult, if not impossible, to manifest any pro-Palestinianism, any commitment to Palestine on Israeli university campuses. These places, apart from anything else, are highly militarized. There are some Israeli university campuses where there are students who are soldiers in the IDF who are walking around in their military uniforms. Israeli universities themselves have been completely upfront and proud of the efforts that they're making to support the war effort in Gaza. So Israeli universities have introduced any number of measures, things like student credits, special tuition sessions, concessions or special arrangements for examinations, events on campus. There's this very concerted effort underway on Israeli campuses to show that Israeli higher education is behind the army and supporting those of its students who have been called up to serve in Gaza and the West Bank. So there's no surprise about what side Israeli universities are on. And it's obvious that Palestinian students find that, deeply alienating. And the status that they already have as purely second-class citizens has only been exacerbated. It's only got worse in the current climate that's been in place since the 7th of October. If you're a Palestinian, you're already a second-class citizen in Israeli universities, and yet you can't go and study in Palestine either. So it's very difficult. If you live in East Jerusalem, for instance, it's extremely difficult and time-consuming to get to Birzeit University, for example. Even though it's very nearby, it's not far at all. But you can spend hours and hours stuck in checkpoints, being deliberately prevented from getting to class on time, being compulsorily searched. Particularly if you're a woman, if you're a woman and you wear a headscarf, there's significant evidence that you're discriminated against by members of the IDF. So these kinds of harassment and obstruction are what Palestinian students had to contend with before October the 7th, and it's got even worse since.
Thank you, sir. So these are the external condition of Palestine, like an outside force come from an outside place and just oppress them. So this is Israeli oppression. So you also mentioned about some internal problems that distracting their education. Like you mentioned about Hamas and their intervention in the education. Can you speak about that?
Uh, I, I'm not sure I've understood your question correctly. I don't think I referred to Hamas. Is that what you were asking about?
Yeah, along with this external struggles of Israeli oppression, they're also facing some internal problems in the place itself.
Right. I mean, I think the most important thing to stress is the obstruction of Palestinian universities for which Israel is responsible. I mean, Palestinians and Palestinian society have any number of problems and issues like any society does. The most significant obstacle to Palestinian educational justice, though, is simply the relentless attacks that Israel places universities under, whether that's in Gaza or the West Bank, and also the structural oppression that the whole context of the occupation places on Israeli universities. Zionists sometimes have claimed, so Carey Nelson, who is one of the most prominent Zionists in the US and who has written several books against the academic boycott, he has claimed that the greatest threat to academic freedom in Palestinian universities comes from Palestinians themselves. So he feels able to make that claim. That's an absurd claim. Because Palestinians themselves aren't holding their own universities in a permanent siege. They're not the ones who are, bombing every university in Gaza to rubble. So there is a move which some Zionists like to make, which is to claim that that the conditions for academic freedom are not met in Palestine already. I mean, Carey Nelson even goes so far as to claim that this is for cultural reasons. So that, to me, seems a nakedly racist claim. He's claiming that Palestinian culture is somehow constitutively hostile to academic freedom. That's a purely racist claim, it seems to me. And the purpose of these kinds of argument is always to deflect attention from the fact that the overwhelmingly greatest obstacle to Palestinian educational justice is the occupation, the siege, and now the genocide.
Yes, sir, I understood. So my next question is that I want to know about this Hasbara or the political strategy utilized by Israel to make a good public image out of the world about them. So can you speak about that, Hasbara?
Yes, I mean, that's just a word that means we could perhaps translate as something like propaganda. And we know that Israel invests a very large amount of funding in spreading messages and ideas that are favourable to it in communities that are important to it. So particularly in the global north, but not just in the global north. And so we know that Israel employs large numbers of people to intervene online, for example, in order to counter expressions of support for Palestine and to argue for Israel and make the case for the genocide, for example, and to convince people in the global north that supporting Israel is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And there's an interesting connection with universities, which is that it's in fact possible at a number of Israeli universities to get course credit for taking part in these kinds of Hasbara activities. So a number of Israeli universities run courses which students can take for credit. And then there are other programs as well, where you can essentially be trained and participate in this kind of pro-Israeli propagandizing as part of your university degree. And that possibility, I think, these courses are called things like, the online ambassadors program. That's the name of one of them. And these kinds of course show, I think, how invested the Israeli state and Israeli society is in the importance of this kind of activity. They acknowledge that that good repute for Israel in the West is something which is strategically important for the maintenance of a Jewish ethno-state, a Jewish supremacist ethno-state in historic Palestine. That becomes infinitely harder if Israel isn't the object of the goodwill of the international community. And that's why so much resources gets invested in these kinds of Hasbara initiative. And that, I think, should give us some encouragement, because it shows us that the kinds of levers that we can press in the Palestine solidarity movement are actually important ones, because obviously all we have at our disposal are levers of reputation and repute and Israel's good name. They're the things we're trying to socially isolate Israel. And these Hasbara efforts tell us that that's the last thing that the Israeli state wants to happen.
Okay, sir. So, amid ideological manipulation in academia, seen in Israel's suppression of Palestinian culture and their language, we know that how they suppressed Arabic in their universities. And recently, Trump's decision to withhold funding from Harvard University for falling to suppress student activism supporting Palestine. Do universities genuinely promote critical thinking, or are they becoming tools of ideological control under liberal rhetoric? Are the humanities, you mentioned about the importance of humanities, are the humanities equipped to effectively resist such manipulation, or are they also falling in their mission? They're failing in their mission.
Right. Yes. So that's a really interesting question, and it's something that I take up later in the book. And I think you're right to focus on the question of the humanities, especially, because, I mean, for one thing, the humanities have been particularly prominent in boycott efforts. So in many parts of the world, I think it's fair to say that it's humanities scholars in particular who've been especially receptive to the boycott call. If you look at the academic associations, for instance, that have actually officially committed to boycotting Israel, they're almost exclusively humanities associations. And that's, I think, got something to do with the fact that the humanities do still think of themselves as critical intellectual enterprises. So the object of critique is important, I think, as part of the self-image of the humanities in general. And even if there's less of an overt commitment to critique, I think there's still an idea that many humanities scholars have that what they're doing is something that's inherently progressive. If you're studying literature or history or philosophy or any of the traditional humanities subjects, there's this feeling that you're doing something which is essentially good and that might not have social effects which are very easy to pinpoint and identify, but nevertheless those effects are positive ones. So that's important to the humanities self-image. But in the book, as you've sort of suggested, I do criticise that, because the humanities aren't any one thing. Obviously, the humanities are complicated, and they have all sorts of conflicting and contradictory sort of ideological forces that are going through them. And I think we don't spend nearly enough time thinking about the ways in which humanities research can be not critical and can be not progressive. And once we start exploring this, this particular theme, the ways in which the humanities and scholarship in general can be reactionary, it's very hard to stop, because there's just so much we can say. So maybe I can just talk about two aspects in particular of the way that I think we can see these sort of reactionary tendencies. The first is the very firm distinction that is typically drawn between scholarship and political action. There's a very strong idea that scholarship, if it's to be scholarship, must be politically neutral. There's this idea that whatever you do, you can't take sides. And not only can't you take sides, you can't even express sort of norms or evaluations about what is right, which have any kind of immediate political impact. So you referred, for instance, to Trump's, current blackmail of US of various universities in the US, Columbia, Harvard, and so on. And I think there's something interesting about that, which is that, as many people have pointed out, the reason that Columbia, for instance, or one of the reasons that Columbia essentially accepted the conditions that Trump was imposing on it, was that this is sort of what Columbia wanted anyway. There was a sense in which the kinds of restrictions on Palestinian calls for justice that Trump was insisting on fitted very well with the vision that the leaders of Columbia itself had for the nature of their university. So these illiberal instincts, these ideas that scholarship is something which has to exist in its own realm, separated from everything else, that's something which I think is very deeply embedded in many academics' image of themselves. We think that what our job is to do is to analyze. We study the world. We don't intervene in it. And not only don't we intervene in it ourselves, we have to hold back from expressing any views that are too sort of marked or forceful about it, in case that upsets anyone too much. So that posture of scholarly withdrawal is the first way, I think, that the culture of academic research and teaching can be reactionary, because when you adopt a culture of withdrawal, you're essentially just acquiescing to the status quo. You're saying nothing needs to change. And the second way that I'm conscious of these sort of reactionary and authoritarian tendencies in academia is particularly marked in the humanities. And it consists in the way that so much of what goes on when we teach in the humanities is at the discretion of the lecturer. So, for example, if I teach, I'm teaching a class at the moment in semantics, a subject called semantics, which is about meaning in language. And the truth is, we know hardly anything about meaning in language. We know hardly anything about how it works. Yet, what I have to do as the lecturer is make a claim to knowledge. And I also get to choose about what is in and out of the subject. I get to choose what does and doesn't constitute a good answer on my student's part. And even if there are always good reasons that I make that choice, it's very frequently the case that other people would have made different choices. So what I value in my assessment of my students' work is not the same as what one of my colleagues would value. You know, we see this all the time. Colleagues disagree all the time about what a subject should be like, what constitutes good work in that subject. And so there's this discretionary element in lots of academic work. There's a very significant part that's played by the personal judgment and sort of taste, if you want, of the individual academic. Yet that individual side to academic work is very rarely avowed. It's very rarely admitted to. And we typically pretend that the essentially discretionary judgments we make about what is good work, what is and isn't part of a field, what should and shouldn't be, an appropriate subject for investigation. All of these things are largely made on the basis of taste, and we pretend that they're not. We pretend that they're made on, if not objective grounds, then on grounds that are highly sort of reasonable and rational, and that don't have this personal element. And I see that, and students realise this. Students realise very early on when they study the humanities that a lot of it is about giving the lecturer what they want. And so students learn to accustom themselves to a certain form of arbitrary domination, I think. They learn that what the lecturer says goes, and that if they want to get a good mark, they have to sort of comply with the lecturer's preferences, even though it's obvious to everyone that those things are no more than preferences, and that a different lecturer would have a different set of preferences. So there's this. So students are accustomed, I think, to accepting a certain form of arbitrary and probably unjustifiable domination. And that, I think, is something that sort of butters them up or gets them ready on the symbolic level to, and justifies as well, this idea that domination can be arbitrary but still in place. And still something that they simply have to accept. So when they leave university, they will, and when they start doing a full-time job, they'll have other forms of essentially discretionary and arbitrary domination that they will have to comply to. Their employers, their landlords, their politicians. And it seems to me that in the university and in humanities classrooms in particular, they get a very particular kind of training in this, because they are trained to comply with and then also later to exercise a particular kind of discretionary and unjustified power, which presents itself as objective and as justified. So that's a quite long answer. I'm sorry about that, but there are two ways in which I think the scholarship and universities don't serve critical and emancipatory ends. The problem is it's very hard to see ways in which we might imagine the university differently in order to escape from those problems.
Okay, sir. So there are still people in universities, in Western universities, who support this academic boycott, and they truly want to participate in this boycott activities and movements for Palestinian liberation. But because of the practices in universities, like they always demands for political neutrality, and there are a lot of academic pressures on them. They have to do overwork after the classes, part-time jobs, all are there. So there are people having no time to, or they are not able to participate in these movements because of the restrictions placed by those universities. So how can they take part in such actions if university is doing like this?
Yeah, that's a key question, obviously. I mean, no one really can take effective action on their own. So any kind of political action is necessarily collective. It's necessarily something that is done as a group of people. And I'd suggest that, in this issue, in the issue of the fight against genocide and apartheid and ethnic cleansing in historic Palestine, words are very important. So something as simple as starting a collective statement. I mean, we saw a collective statement just last week from Swedish academics. So a large number, hundreds of Swedish academics signed a collective statement last week saying that they would, put various forms of pressure and isolation on Israeli universities in order to promote justice for Palestine. Even a fairly simple gesture like that, starting a statement and asking people to sign it, and talking to people about why they should sign it, holding meetings where people can come and ask questions about the campaign and why it's important to join it. Simple gestures like these can be very powerful, I think. And in fact, I think we've seen the evidence of the power of gestures like these, but it does necessitate collective action, I think. It requires people to cooperate with each other and work in groups.
So you have mentioned about this, like the two big things between ideas, theories, and actual practice. Many academicians are actually focusing on these ideas, and they are not coming in forefront to do so. So how do you analyze the idea between ideas and this actual political activity?
Yeah, that's a theme that I'm particularly interested in because, as I said before, there is this idea that what we do in universities, particularly in the humanities, is inherently politically progressive without us doing anything to make it that. Just the mere fact of studying history or studying politics or studying literature or music or philosophy or whatever it might be, there's this idea that just in virtue of doing that, we're doing something which is socially valuable. And I think, we do need to question that that assumption more than we do. And we need to think about the ways in which sometimes ideas are anything but progressive. So to give the most obvious example, ideas which are designed to justify the current genocide are reactionary, and there is nothing progressive about universities engaging in them or fostering in them. Quite the contrary. The kinds of political ideas or moral ideas or historical ideas that are promoted with the objective of justifying, the death of the murder of tens upon tens of thousands of people, and the flattening of entire sectors, the majority of the Gaza Strip. There is nothing progressive about those ideas whatsoever. And we can point to lots of examples, I think, where academic research simply isn't progressive in any other way, in other ways as well. So one of the things I do in the book, for instance, is talk about a situation in Germany in 2015, 2016, where Institute for Historical Research republished Hitler's Mein Kampf, so the work in which Hitler laid out his vision of German politics and the future of Germany. I mean, it's obviously, it's in many ways the sort of founding charter of Nazism, and so responsible for the horrific genocide against the Jewish people and against, many gay people and Romani people and mentally disabled people that happened in the 1940s. And the republication of this work with a very rigorous scholarly apparatus designed to show that Hitler's claims were all wrong. This work was presented as a work of progressive scholarship. But one of the things that I show in the book is that arguably it had the effect of creating a mass market or a new Hitler phenomenon. It put Hitler back on the front page of the German press and of German media in a way that he hadn't previously been. And there was a real controversy in Germany about whether the right thing to do was to republish this work and to do the scholarly historical work that was involved in it. And to me, the answer is fairly clear. So to me, the answer is that it was quite a serious political mistake. And it's a good example of of a wider fact, which is that we can't just assume that the work that we do is progressive and virtuous just because we're doing it. We have to think very carefully about the context that we're doing it in and the possible effects that it will have, first and foremost, actually, on our students. What are the right kinds of curriculum and syllabus that it's important to present students with at a time like this in a genocide?
Okay, sir. So what I understood is that sometimes it's good to prohibit any academic exchanges. Sometimes it's good not to have any academic exchanges because it will create misconceptions about a particular concept, something like that. So how would you consider the thing called free speech in universities? Like who decide what to speak and when to speak? So there is some power play in that. Can you please explain on that?
Yes. Did you say there's power play in that? Is that how you put it?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yep. Well, look, yes, this is complicated but important. Free speech, obviously, academic freedom, intellectual freedom is absolutely central to the mission of the university. It's absolutely essential that scholars in universities be free to research in the way that they see fit and to pursue the questions that they think are important. And we have to categorically reject, I think, any form of interference by the state or by any other powerful actor. Corporations are one obvious example in the contemporary context. We need to absolutely reject any idea that academic work should be directed by anyone other than academics themselves. It's absolutely essential if what we want is research that is actually going to have any kind of intellectual integrity. But that doesn't mean that academics themselves aren't free to make their own choices about who they collaborate with. And one of the things that I show at length in the book is that just as a matter of fact, academics are boycotting each other all the time. So Zionists like to present the academic boycott of Israel as something that's exceptional. And they say to us, as I said before, you're singling out Israel. Why are you doing that? Why are you just boycotting Israel? And I've already suggested that it's not true. But it's not true on another and a deeper level, which is that academia regularly involves decisions about who to collaborate with and who not to collaborate with. And those decisions are very often made on political grounds. So to just give one example, I'll give a couple of examples. So no one hesitated when Russia invaded Ukraine and when there was a call to boycott complicit Russian institutions that were complicit with the attacks on the Ukrainian people. So that was never felt to be incompatible with academic professionalism or anything like that. Similarly, there's a long-standing campaign to boycott profiteering multinational academic publishers, groups like Elsevier, for example, because these groups have this business model which consists in them taking work that is created at universities, many of which are publicly funded, publishing it, and then selling it back to those universities in the form of scholarly journals and books at absolutely extortionate prices. So these multinational publishers are profiteers. They're the enemies of free knowledge, and many universities, or many academics rather, have signed up to boycott them. And that is a very clear example of a case where what academics are essentially doing is obstructing the exchange of ideas. They are saying, we will not publish in this journal. We will not do peer reviews for this journal. We will, break ties with this journal. We will cut ourselves off from the circulation of academic ideas in order to bring about this greater good, which is a publication model that isn't based on profit. And no one suggests that it's a violation of academic freedom to do that. It's only when it's Israel that is the target that people start complaining about academic freedom. So I think it's important to see the university and academic work as this arena where academics are continually making choices about who they will and won't collaborate with. And another way of putting that is choices about who they will and won't boycott. So there's nothing actually that's exceptional about the boycott in academic life. In one sense, we're boycotting each other all the time. And Stephen Salaita has said this very clearly. He says, the problem with BDS in the eyes of Zionists is not that it's a boycott, it's that the target is Israel. And I think that's exactly correct.
Okay, sir. So my final question is that what inspired you to write this book, or what are the facts that inspired you to write this and move on with this?
Well, I've been involved in the Palestine solidarity movement for some time and been closely involved with the academic boycott. So over that time, I had accumulated a whole lot of ideas about it and arguments about it. My main motivation, though, was to produce something for critics of the academic boycott so that we could, and there are already excellent books on the academic boycott. There's Sunayana Myra's book called Boycott. There are a number of excellent books on the academic boycott, and we need more of them. But I think that it's very important to be able to show that the boycott is something which is reasoned and which you can write a book to justify. Because if you can do that, and if you can show that, you've got a way of responding to these accusations that get made about us, which is that where the whole boycott campaign is just this highly prejudiced, reactionary, thoughtless, probably anti-Semitic enterprise. And that's all nonsense. And it helps. It helps to be able to point to a book and say, look, you don't understand it? Read this. There's actually something that you have to understand and that you don't. So I think I hope that it will be a useful tool for the sort of intellectual legitimation and justification and promotion of the boycott in universities.
Thank you, sir. Do you want anything to add more to this discussion?
No, other than to just say thank you very much for having hosted me. And I hope it's been useful, and to wish you all the best for your efforts in Kerala.
It's really our pleasure to have you with us. Thank you for this wonderful opportunity that you have given us to know about this issue much deeply. So I think if there is any question for the audience to ask, they can ask now. Is there anyone? So I think no one is there. So can we wind it up? So thank you for your active participation here. I now invite our college chairperson, union chairperson, Dijo Jos, to deliver the vote of thanks. Dijo, over to you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. It was a truly thought-provoking and a very nice session, which helped us to understand the deeper connection between academia, activism, and justice. Thank you all for being a part of this incredibly valuable session. Session like these reminds us of the power of dialogue and the responsibility we carry as learners and educators. A heartfelt thank you to our speaker, Dr. Nick Raymer, for sharing his insight and challenging us to think critically and act ethically. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your insights. A special thanks to Sandra Sabu, our first year student, for leading this conversation with clarity and confidence. I also extend my sincere thanks to our principal for the warm welcome and continued support for our meaningful initiatives. And finally, a big thank you to all the participants who joined from all around the globe for the presence. Your presence made this event a really special one. So once again, thank you all.
Thank you for joining with us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So with that, officially we wrap up this session. Heartfelt thanks to Dr. Nick Raymer and everyone who has joined. Have a great day ahead. Thank you.